Welcome to Beneath the Bible, where we're helping you dig deeper and uncover the world beneath the sacred book. Today we're starting a short series on two ancient Near Eastern deities who were closely associated with Israel's God, Yahweh. Next week we'll look at Baal, the chief rival of Yahweh, a figure who's talked about a lot in the Bible, but from whom the Israelites also seem to borrow a lot of their imagery for Yahweh. Today, though, we're talking about Asherah, a female deity who is reviled within the Bible, but possibly revered outside of it. Now, the Near East has been connected by trade routes for millennia, over both land and sea, and these routes facilitated the exchange of goods as well as beliefs throughout the ancient world. The site of Kuntalet Ajrud, which sits in the Sinai Peninsula, was once a hub of trade between Egypt and the Levantine coast. In the early 8th century, it operated as something like a caravan way station. It's possible there was also a shrine associated with the site, but that isn't entirely clear. What we do know is that as travelers visited the site, many of them left graffiti on the walls and on the large, usually immobile storage jars at the site. On one of these jars, we find this mess of images. Above the images, we find this inscription, which is offering a blessing to the next traveler to stop by. It reads, "May Yahweh of Samaria and his Asherah bless you." Now, who is this Asherah? What do we know about her from the Near Eastern world and the Bible? And in the polytheistic world that Israel found itself in, why does the Bible have such animus for Baal and for Asherah? We'll look at those questions today.
Our sources on Asherah come from both text and archaeology, and we'll examine Asherah in the Bible and Israelite archaeology soon enough, but we want to start with what we know about Asherah from outside the Bible, because the goddess has a very long history before the Old Testament period. The earliest possible reference to Asherah comes from the site of Ebla in Syria, which dates to the 24th century BC, over 4,000 years ago. A more certain reference to the goddess is found in the Amarna letters, where we find references to a goddess named Ashirtu. In a 15th century Akkadian text found at the site of Tahanak, the letter's author asks for a wizard of Asherah. Other Akkadian references from Mesopotamia refer to as Ashratum, and she is sometimes called variously the Lady of the Steppe, the Bride of the King of Heaven, and the Mistress of Sexual Vigor and Rejoicing. She was associated with the Amorites, people who migrated into Mesopotamia from in and around Syria, so it's no surprise that when we look at the site of Ugarit in Syria, we find the fullest exploration of who Asherah was. At Ugarit, the goddess was called Atharatu, though she also had many epithets. The meaning of this name is debated, but it likely means something like place, like with the connotation being a sanctuary or holy place. She was also called Kudshu, which means holy one. And this can also apply to sanctuaries, which further strengthens the idea that Atharatu means place. She also has names like Asherah of the Sea and Asherah of Tyre or Sidon, which suggests she originally had a close connection with the sea. In Ugaritic mythic literature, she is the wife of El, the old patriarchal creator god. For this reason, it makes sense she is sometimes called Mother of the Gods or Procreatress of the Gods. The Council of the Gods, or the minor deities in the Ugaritic pantheon, are called the 70 children of Asherah. She is portrayed as a dignified elder lady, a respectable queen mother who serves as the powerful and influential matriarch of the divine family. She intercedes for Baal to El when Baal seeks permission to build himself a temple, whereas Baal's wife Anat had been unsuccessful in convincing El to allow this. Asherah is able to persuade him. In some Ugaritic literature, Asherah and Anat seem to be conflated, and this likely happened as Asherah waned in popularity while Anat rose. There are a number of reasons for this, and one is that over time Baal came to be the primary deity in the Ugaritic pantheon, replacing El. Since Baal was married to Anat, it makes some sense that Anat and Asherah, as the wife of the creator god and formerly chief god, are conflated. Studies of personal names at Ugarit show that over time, more and more parents were naming their children with names that included elements of Anat and Baal and fewer from Asherah and El. As Anat became more popular, Asherah faded, and Anat took on some of the qualities of Asherah as the primary goddess. At Ugarit, this fusion seems to emphasize maternal qualities. Anat and Asherah functioned as the nurses of the gods, as we see in the Kara epic. Outside of Ugarit, Asherah took on a less maternal role, and as her identity was conflated with a number of other goddesses, she became more associated with fertility, something we can see in the archaeology. Our first example of Asherah in ancient Near Eastern archaeology takes us back to Ugarit, where we see her as a matronly goddess. On this ivory panel, likely originally from a bed frame, we see the goddess suckling two figures, and these are probably Shakar and Shalim, the gods of dawn and dusk. And this scene is related to an annual celebration of the sacred marriage of El and Asherah, as well as a known mythic story about this event. This statuette is also a likely depiction of the matronly goddess Asherah. She is shown seated with a horned crown indicating her divinity, and she has a long tunic befitting someone of high status. In Egypt, however, we see the equivalent of Asherah appears with more fertility aspects than matronly ones. This is the goddess Khudsu, which we've seen as a common epithet of Asherah. This name appears on inscriptions and amulets, and in visual depictions, Khudsu is shown nude with the so-called Hathor wig, often standing on a line with some combination of snakes and lotuses in her hands. She's often depicted this way alongside the gods Resheph and Min, and in an example from Thebes, now in the collection of Winchester College in England, the goddess is named Khudsu Astarte Anna, indicating a kind of fusion of three goddesses. And this is one example of a much larger question of when and to what degree Asherah is conflated with the Canaanite goddess Anna and Astarte. As we've seen, this conflation had already begun to some degree at Ugarit, but to what extent that continued in the Iron Age isn't clear. The Bible certainly distinguishes between these three goddesses, but it isn't always clear why it distinguishes them the way that it does. There are also examples in archaeology where Asherah seems to be represented symbolically. Asherah, it seems, could be presented as a tree or even just a triangle. The symbol of a tree flanked by ibexes was a very common motif on Canaanite pottery of the Middle and Late Bronze Age. These symbols appear frequently on pottery and other media, which means Asherah may be represented quite frequently in the archaeological record. This artifact is the so-called Lachish ewer. It was found in many pieces during excavations at the site of Lachish in Israel during the early 20th century. It was found outside the city in what is called the Phos Temple. The pottery itself isn't of particular interest, but the decoration is. Here you can see a drawing of the decoration. There are repeating trees with ibexes flanking the trees, and there's a partial inscription that says Matan, an offering to my lady Elat. Matan is the name of the person making the offering, and he was offering the jar, or more likely, its contents, at the temple to the lady Elat. At Ugarit, this is another name for Asherah. The name Elat actually appears over the tree. Now there's a ton we could talk about with tree imagery, but for now we want to note that scholars generally accept that in some instances, like we see here, the tree is standing in for the goddess. On this goblet from the same structure at Lachish, we see the decoration has ibexes flanking not a tree, but a triangle. Art historians call this the pubic triangle because it seems to be a stylization of female genitalia, and these two artifacts taken together from similar contexts suggest a goddess, in this case Asherah, could be portrayed symbolically as either a tree or a triangle. And these textual and archaeological findings provide a number of insights into the way Asherah is portrayed in the Bible.
The name Asherah appears about 40 times in the Old Testament, and the biblical writers have a particular animus toward Asherah. Now, there are times when it is clearly referring to the deity that we'll discuss shortly, but it often refers to a cult object, something called an Asherah pole. In 2 Kings 21, the king Manasseh is condemned for putting an image of Asherah in the temple. This passage makes the most sense if it's referencing the actual deity. Josiah's reforms include removing cult objects of Baal, Asherah, and all the hosts of heaven. In Judges, Ashtaroth and Baal are paralleled, and both are condemned. Finally, during Elijah's contest with the prophets of Baal, we often forget that it also says there were prophets of Asherah there as well. Now, this wouldn't make sense that there are prophets of Baal and then prophets of a cult object rather than another deity. So it is clear that the goddess is referenced, and Asherah does not only refer to a cult object. Now, nevertheless, most of the Old Testament references to Asherah make sense as referring to cult objects. It's not clear what exactly this object was. Some English translations will translate this object as an Asherah pole, but the actual word used is just Asherahs. Now, with that caveat, we think that the Asherah object was probably a wooden pole. It may or may not have been carved or incised with the image of the goddess or symbols sacred to her. Other plausible suggestions include things like a grove of trees, a singular standing tree, or some manufactured cult object made out of stone or metal. The easiest understanding, however, is that this was an upright wooden pole that was specifically associated with the goddess, and it came to be equated with the goddess, leading the objects themselves to be called Asherahs. Now, this actually makes some sense because the name Asherah can mean something like place, specifically a holy place or sanctuary. She was even called Khudsu, or Holy One, so the linking of the goddess with sacred places and sacred objects isn't a huge stretch. Additionally, we saw that Asherah could be depicted as a tree, so it makes sense that a cult object of a wooden pole was associated with Asherah. There are still some questions, however, about how we handle the biblical texts about Asherah and what we learn about Asherah in Israelite archaeology. The archaeology of ancient Israel paints a very different picture of how everyday Israelites related to Asherah compared to what we see in the Bible. Asherah appears in a number of places in the archaeology of Iron Age 1 and 2 in what we now call Israel. We don't have any Asherah poles or anything like that, but we do see possible depictions of the goddess, archaeologically recovered inscriptions that reference her, and possibly a depiction of an Asherah pole. The first notable artifacts are called Judean pillar figurines. These small clay figurines are found in large quantities around Judah in the 7th and 8th centuries, primarily in domestic contexts. They vary in form and production and seem to have some regional variations. They are obviously female. They have arms, usually over or supporting the chest, and a feminine face. Now, despite their prevalence, scholars aren't quite sure what these figurines represent. They could just be toys. They could be representing regular women. We know that other ancient Near Eastern cultures used small figurines for magical practices, so these could be a part of some heretofore unknown magical custom in Judah. This is the perspective of some of the more recent studies on these figurines. However, I'd say most scholars still agree that they represent a goddess. But which goddess is it? Is it an Anat Astarte Asherah fusion? Is it a Syrian goddess? Is it the mother goddess or a fertility goddess? Is it a representation of plenty, something like the Judahite idea of shalom or right order? Well, maybe. Those are all possibilities. But many scholars, for many different reasons, have concluded that these are representations of Asherah. Their widespread use suggests that representations of Asherah were at least tolerated within Judahite society at this time. They certainly weren't some kind of forbidden black magic. Instead, they seem to be representations of Asherah that were used by everyday people, probably women, and were objects of prayer or wishes. Asherah veneration seems to have been a minor but accepted Israelite custom, and it seems like she was one who would readily bestow blessing on people. We certainly see this in inscriptional evidence. At Khirbet al-Qom, archaeologists found this inscription, which can be translated to something like this. This may be reminiscent of the Kuntelet Ajrud graffiti that we discussed at the beginning. These inscriptions are often studied together by scholars because they obviously have so much in common. Now, for our purposes, we'll just highlight that they both call for blessing from Yahweh and His Asherah. Now, this phrase has caused all kinds of interpretive trouble. There are two viable interpretations. One is that the Asherah referenced here is not the goddess. Instead, it is a reference to a cult object, either one of Asherah or one of Yahweh. Now, this seems to be the consensus amongst those who have delved deeply into these inscriptions. Elsewhere at Kuntelet Ajrud is this graffito. It depicts a stylized tree flanked by ibexes, a motif that can be associated with Asherah. Now, this stylized tree might depict an Asherah pole, though this is far from certain. Other scholars still see the references to his Asherah as a reference to Yahweh and his consort, the goddess Asherah, not just a cult object. Now, even if these inscriptions are references to a cult object, we do see Yahweh being paired with Asherah in archaeology. This piece of pottery was found in Jerusalem in the 1920s. It dates to the Iron II and has an incised decoration. The archaeologist Garth Gilmore has analyzed this piece and interprets it as showing Yahweh and Asherah. The figure on the right is taken to be Yahweh, an inverted triangle with a pair of legs. The round top is likely a kind of crown that's known from Canaanite imagery from the Bronze and early Iron Ages. The female figure, likely Asherah, is represented by two triangles, probably recalling the pubic triangle imagery associated with the goddess from the Bronze Age. The two figures are standing over a series of bumps, which may be understood as the natural world. Taken together, this is quite reasonably a depiction of Yahweh and his consort Asherah as they rule over the cosmos. We can see that Asherah depictions and imagery were quite common in ancient Israel, and the veneration of Asherah seems to have been widely practiced and even accepted. Now, the world of the Bible was one filled with many gods and goddesses. We see several of these deities mentioned in the Bible by name, but the Bible reserves particular animus for two of them, Baal and Asherah. So, after everything we've looked at, why was this? When we look at the evidence, the picture that develops is that Asherah veneration was, for a very long time, accepted practice in Israelite religion. Garth Gilmore states that when we look at the evidence from Khirbet al-Qom, Kuntelet Ajrud, the pillar figurines, and the sherd that he examined, all strongly suggest that what has been considered unorthodox or folk religion may instead have been the de facto orthodoxy. Asherah veneration seems to have been an important part of Israelite religion for centuries, but that orthodoxy shifted and changed over time. Yahweh was the primary god that the Israelites worshipped, though Baal also was supported, which explains why the Bible is so critical of Baal. Asherah was also venerated, though never to the same degree as Baal or certainly Yahweh. Now, over time, especially during the reign of Josiah, veneration of Asherah became unorthodox. The prophets and the reforming figures in Jerusalem moved toward the orthodoxy of Yahweh not only as the primary God of Israel, but as the only God, and they cracked down on veneration of Asherah. This is why in the Bible, Asherah and her cult objects are so widely and uniformly condemned. I think this is a vital dynamic for us to understand as we read the Bible. What we have in the Bible is largely the sanctioned orthodox perspective of Israel's religious leaders. The things that we see outlawed were outlawed because they were being practiced by the Israelites, and their leaders saw these beliefs and practices as being in conflict with a proper relationship between Israel and Yahweh. Now, that doesn't mean, however, that these beliefs and practices stopped just because they were no longer sanctioned, as evidenced by the prevalence of Asherah imagery through a long stretch of Israel's history. Now, at other times, the sanctioned practices of Israel actually encouraged the worship of other gods. It was during these times that prophets arose to call the Israelites back to faithfulness to the one true God alone. Now, this same dynamic still holds true as we seek to be faithful to God today. We need to carefully discern who we're listening to and who we're trusting to help us remain on the right path. There's always a great temptation to follow those who tell us what we want to hear or promise the things that we want, regardless of the way we go about getting them. The popular way isn't always the right way, and the faithful way may put us in opposition to the majority. Just as the Israelites understood over time that there is only one true God, so we need to be always discerning and cautious of those who try to set themselves up in God's rightful place. Thanks for joining us for this Beneath the Bible video. If you want to learn more about this topic, we've included some references and resources in the description below. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see more content like it, be sure to subscribe to our channel, give this video a like, and follow us on Twitter and Facebook at Beneath the Bible. If you learned something new today, take a minute to share this video with your friends. And until next time, keep digging.